So the session is being recorded. So I'd like to introduce everybody to the York Society of Engineers and the University of York, because what we do is we offer joint lectures once a month starting in October, and normally we're on the first Thursday of the month. And you can find the lectures advertised in two places. They're advertised at the University of York Open Lectures webpage. So if you just go to Google and enter University of York Open Lectures, it'll then give you a list of those. And also if you go to enter York Society of Engineers on the in Google, you'll also find the lectures there. Now, normally I would be able to say that we have a lecture next month, but this hasn't been arranged yet. But we have managed to arrange the first two. So our hope is to still run the 6 lectures on a monthly basis, and this will be the second. I may have said that the York Society of Engineers is one of the oldest societies, engineering societies in the UK, and we've been going for about 70 years. If anybody wishes to join, please just send me an email. We offer free membership for the first year. So now I'm very pleased to introduce, we're very lucky and pleased to have Sarah Owen-Hughes, who's going to give us a talk on science and the garden this evening. Now, Sarah actually has her introduction on slide 2 of her talk, but she actually wrote me an email today, and she says she does have other interests, which include gin sipping, horn playing, and she's got a beautiful Caterham sports car, which she very much enjoys driving. So we very much like to welcome Sarah to give us her talk on science and the garden. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It's a very strange sensation giving a presentation like this, because all I can see is the front screen of my PowerPoint. So you can wear whatever you like, do whatever you like. I can't see any of you, but I hope you enjoy the talk tonight. Before I go any further, I need to explain the letters at the end of my name on this page. They are MCIOH, which means I'm a member of the Chartered Institute of Horticulture. I have to put those at the end of my name because my children say it makes me look like a spy and it makes my job sound more interesting than bothering plants. So I have been a horticultural lecturer for 15 years. I moved out of education this spring. I don't know if that's permanent or not, but I felt I needed to get back into plants and get back onto the tools, as it were. I still externally examine the programmes for the Eden Project down in Cornwall, where I go twice a year to check that they're teaching to a sufficient level, and at Kirkley Hall in Northumberland, and I do exams work for the RHS as well. I'm one of the first people who's not a plant health inspector to actually form part of the Plant Health Professional Register, which is with the Royal Society of Biology, and I joined that as part of a trial because it's the International Year of Plant Health this year, and we're trying to raise the profile and the professionalism of plant health in the UK and globally. And now my current job is that I'm a pest and disease coordinator in a commercial glasshouse. And as you can see on the photograph, this is again what my children think I do, is sit amongst plants all day, releasing ladybirds and possibly playing the panpipes. I've also been told by my 2 cohorts on this podcast that I need to advertise this very firmly to you all. Trowels and Tribulations is a plant cast. It's 3 of us. One's a curator from a local arboretum, one is a manager at a nursery for adults with learning difficulties, and one's me. And we're just launching a podcast. We have about 8 podcasts available to listen to. So if you like the idea of no nonsense podcasts with a northern twang, please feel free to listen to us. It'll feel like you're gardening with friends, because obviously at the moment we're a little bit short of contact with people around us. So tonight, obviously we're talking about horticulture and horticultural science. Horticultural science is gardening. It is just gardening. I had a student many years ago turn up to a class and look slightly alarmed as I was stood in the glass house. And I said, any questions? After about half an hour, he put his hand up and said, yes, miss, when are we going to see the horses? Because he thought he'd signed up to a horticulture course. And we had to disabuse him of that sad notion, unfortunately, that there were going to be no horses in his lectures from then on. And I'm very aware that we use a lot of technical terms in horticultural science. They can be quite intimidating. I'm sure you have the same in engineering as well. And they can sound quite confusing at times. And this is a photograph of a window in the labs where I used to teach, where I put up botanical band names. So basically terms that I felt sounded like they could be a band name of some sort. I suspect that I would be playing in the necrotic spots if I had the chance. So I will try and use lay terms as much as possible to make things a bit more accessible. But of course, there will be occasional lapses into Latin. I will try and make it a little bit more user-friendly. Please put your hands up, which I think you can do at the bottom of your screen if you have questions, and we'll answer those at the very end. And also, just to explain there, Fraxinus excelsior, the Harry Potter spell, is actually the ash tree. That's the Latin name for it. So let's start with the godfather, the rock father of horticulture, Charles Darwin. I love some of the concepts that come up with Darwin and his thoughts. I actually online, my handle is Darwinian Gardener, because whatever I throw in my garden has to survive. I have children and a dog and a husband who likes digging holes, so things have to be really robust. And I particularly like this thought of Charles Darwin, which is, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor is it the most intelligent. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. And one of the really exciting things about horticultural science is that it's still really, really new. It's one of the newest scientific disciplines. We are still learning a huge amount. And because of that, we are able to adapt and change. So the progression in science from even when I started studying has gone exponentially, shooting through the roof. So if you are a STEM student, for example, who's into science, technology, engineering, mathematics, you should consider horticulture as a career, because we need people who are problem solvers, and there are some phenomenal potential and opportunities. We're growing food for the rest of it, for future generations. We are creating medicines that will cure some of the illnesses that we're looking at the moment, and we're helping combat climate change. But there aren't enough of us, because the perception is horticulture is quite often standing in the long borders contemplating the flowers, when there's a lot more to it, and there's a lot more still to come. To correct Darwin, we always say that Darwin developed the idea of survival of the fittest. It was actually Herbert Spencer in his Principles of Biology who described Charles Darwin's thoughts as survival of the fittest, and he then put it into later editions of his Origin of the Species. And I just wanted to show an example of architectural engineering, where they've taken Darwinian principles beautifully, and they've again changed the way that we think about plant science. And these are the Sainsbury Labs in Cambridge in the Botanic Gardens, funded by the Gatsby Foundation, by Lord Sainsbury. And what they've done is, it hasn't been done before in plant science research, is they've made a completely modular, movable set of laboratories within the building. So you can unbolt your lab bench and you can move it to somewhere else if you need to. It means they can expand and contract with the research that they're doing. They've also deliberately put in two very wide, broad sets of steps, so that people who are doing research can go for a walk of contemplation, which is what Darwin did in the Botanic Gardens. And he would walk with his peers, discussing ideas and bouncing and communicating and talking to people who didn't work in the same discipline to come up with new concepts. So this is what they're trying to replicate in the Sainsbury laboratory. As you can see, it's relatively modern, austere, if you like, but there are some inspirational areas. They have lots of benches outside for people to sit outside, and again to encourage those academic conversations that sometimes, for those of you who work in academia, sometimes they get pushed to the side a little bit, but actually the communicating is the bit that really creates spark. That's where excitement comes from. And they've also got, I don't know if you can see in between the trees, they have large glass discs which are lit up at night and have water features as well. So again, it's supposed to be peaceful and calming and inspirational. And this is the bit that I really love. The public seating areas in the labs have white clean boards, so you can sit with your peers and you can draw and think out loud with your thinking stick in your hand, and again come up with new concepts and solve some of the challenges that we have in horticulture at the moment. So for those who haven't read Darwin for a while, some of the concepts that we will look at tonight are things like overpopulation, which forces variation. This is starting to sound really, really apposite, isn't it? This is very much what we're dealing with at the moment. We have overpopulation that's led to a genetic variation. We then have to adapt, and then we descend into a new generation with modification. That applies to all living beings. There's a factor that forces change, and that's no different when we're looking at plants and plant science. Let's have a look at some of those key dates. I'm not going to make this a history lesson, you can read through these yourself, but if you imagine that it was only in the 1600s that the microscope was invented, and in the 1600s that we started to notice and identify single cells, that hopefully helps to explain why science, horticultural science, is so new. These are really, really recent if you think about it, if you think about how we develop thoughts and ideas. Carl Linnaeus from 1758 developed the nomenclature, which are the common names that we use, the common Latin names that we use for plants, using a genus and a species. So we only started agreeing on calling plants the same name globally in the middle of the 1700s. I had to put in that women started botanical painting in the 1760s because we weren't allowed to up until that point. It was felt that plants and plant reproduction was far too graphic for us to actually be interested in up until that point. Interestingly, again, the only time I've ever seen someone have an attack of the vapours, for want of a better word, was a large male agriculture student who, when I was busy dissecting a primrose to look at the reproductive organs, wasn't upset by the scalpel, wasn't upset by any of the science equipment I had around me, but went green at the thought of there being male and female sexual organs in the same flower. He got terribly upset about it. So a lot has changed since 1760. Chlorophyll in the 1800s, again, chlorophyll, for those who have a dim and distant memory of photosynthesis, it's the one thing of biology that you sort of really remember from school, is that somehow chlorophyll absorbs sunlight and makes energy. If only I could feed my kids that way, I'd roll their sleeves up and send them outside onto the doorstep. They'd probably starve in North Yorkshire at the moment, but it would be a phenomenal activity. We'll look at chlorophyll in a little bit because, again, we're starting to really understand the potential of using it to make energy. And then 1862, photosynthesis. We didn't even know about it until then. So we knew about chlorophyll, we didn't know about photosynthesis for another 50 years. Beijerinck, discovered a Mosaic virus in 1898. So again, this is starting to get a bit recent. This is when you might have had a relative who was born at this period, at this stage. You might have had a grandparent or what have you from that time, discovering that viruses are smaller than bacteria. And again, particularly apposite at the moment, but plant viruses, as with any other virus, are particularly difficult for us to treat, so we have to look at them in a different way. Arthur Galston, 1920s to 2008. This is starting to get within our era now. We, some of you may remember Agent Orange that he discovered in the 40s. It's now no longer used, thankfully. It was used in biological warfare, but it was originally used to help plants grow. And the challenge for us as growers, as gardeners, is to produce the best possible crops that we can, whether it's ornamental and it looks beautiful, or whether it is a heavy yield. And if you consider that something like a wheat crop might take 20 weeks, for example, to grow from being put in the field to being harvested, if you have that crop and you find a method of speeding up its growth, so for example, it would take 18 weeks to grow, you're massively increasing the potential to grow another crop and therefore another crop in the field. So these sorts of experiments have been done for forever, but they are only relatively recently we've realised the impact of using certain hormones, certain treatments, and how that has a longer term impact on the environment around us. As well as being gardeners, we are farmers and we're custodians of the soil, and the soil is not easy to replicate and replace when it gets damaged. Anyone who did A-level biology will probably get flashbacks at this point as they see rubisco and start to twitch wildly, as Melvin Calvin discovered or explained properly the Calvin cycle, which is the full explanation of photosynthesis. The last time I was down at the Sainsbury lab in Cambridge, I had a conversation with a lady who was trying to alter the genetic chain in between ADP and NADPH on the diagram there. And she was trying to modify it so it would knock out a few days in the Calvin cycle process. So again, it would lead to wheat being grown in about 18 weeks rather than 20 weeks. And she'd spent 7 years working on it and hadn't been successful. And I was full of admiration for this, because she was going into work every day knowing that what she was going to do would almost certainly lead in failure. But she didn't see it like that. She said, well, it's just crossing something else off the list for me to try. And I said to her, where are you going next? And she said, well, actually, you know, I think I've crossed everything off that I can. So I'm just going to move slightly further down that chain and start modifying that for another 7 years. And I was just full of admiration for that dedication and tenacity, because again, that's how we're going to solve problems and how we're going to develop plant science further. Thimman was the guy who vocalized, explained one of the key concepts in plant science, and it goes back to that original term I showed you earlier that said apical dominance, and the one that I think sounds like a thrash metal band, and that was the role of hormones in plants. And auxin in particular is quite an exciting hormone. When a plant grows, there are auxins in the meristem and the very tip of the plant and the tip of the roots, and it moves around, sends messages through the plant so it continues to grow. If anything ever happens to that auxin, it stops releasing the chemical further down into the plant, sending a message to the buds, the dormant buds that are down the sides of the plant, that something has happened and that plant is threatened. So those buds no longer receive auxins and they suddenly put on bushy growth. Now that's applied by gardeners every day. When we mow the lawn, we are cutting off the apical dominance to force the grass to produce lateral shoots. So it's bushier, so it's healthier, so it looks more green. When we grow a hedge, how many times, there are a number of gardeners with us tonight, so hello to you all. How many times have you planted a hedge for a customer and said to them, please don't just take the tops off until it's exactly at the height you want it, because once you take those tips off, it doesn't really want to grow much higher, it just fattens out. And this very spindly hedge that they've been growing for 2 or 3 years suddenly becomes a full, dense hedge. When we're pruning fruit trees to encourage better fruiting, better flowering, we are using this dominance by knocking out the auxins in the plant to produce those side shoots. So we are deliberately manipulating and stimulating and stressing the plant. So this is a really, really exciting concept. They've done some research recently where they sent up seeds to the International Space Station, and they've tried to grow the seeds in zero gravity. They glue them down because obviously where else would they go? They glue them onto Petri dishes and they grow them. And they're finding that a lot of the plants are spiraling round because they're confused, because they just don't know which way they should grow. And whilst it is possible to grow in space, we're finding that plants are less successful, less nutrient rich, and obviously stressed. And again, we're starting to work on methods that we can grow in space without soil, without gravity, without daylight, organized daylight that we know. And this is part of the research that's going on at the moment in the world. That's just a quick diagram of capitated plants and apical dominance. That's how you get your side shoots. So again, if you're growing your sweet peas and you pinch out the tips, you suddenly get lots of flowers coming out at the sides. And that's because those little buds there have received the message that they're no longer getting the auxin. They're under stress. Every time a deer grazes the top of a plant, or a rabbit eats it, or we pinch it out, we are again meddling with nature. We're controlling nature. We are changing what happens in that plant, and we're using it to our advantage to grow a shorter, fatter, wider plant. It's why the dandelions in your lawn flower on short stems. If you leave that lawn, they would carry on flowering nice and high, but because every time you mow, you're knocking out the tops, it's stress, so it flowers lower down because it still needs to flower. Plants only flower when they've had a stress stimulus. They think their life is over. They've probably just come through a tough winter, or they've had a change in daylight, and so they are trying to reproduce. That's their message, that they want to make seeds. So we again decapitate them. We take off those dead heads to make more flowers, because the plant will continue to flower because it's wanting to reproduce. Roger Whittaker used to wear a cardigan, didn't he, and whistle? I don't mean him at all. Robert Whittaker from 1920 to 1980, again starting to get into my era now, proposed that there were 5 kingdoms of life, and we will talk a little bit about the fungal kingdom, which is extremely exciting for horticulturists. It gets lumped with us more often than not. Horticulturists, people presume that we know all about mushrooms, but actually fungi are very, very different to plants in the traditional way that we understand it. They're actually more close to animals in lots of ways. And also, we mustn't forget that some of the protists and Monera have a direct impact on the plants as well. But again, it was only in 1969 that we had these 5 kingdoms identified and separated out. So again, we're still classifying, we're still learning, we're still trying to identify the differences, and of course recognize the similarities of life, of the kingdoms that we're looking at. This is where we get, this is what my kids call the David Attenborough moment. This is where I suddenly draw it down and we start talking about how sad things are at the moment, because there's going to be redemption out of this. Okay, so this is the low point. So in 1998, the conclusion of a 20-year study found that 1 out of 8 of every known plant species is threatened with extinction. That doesn't include species that we don't know about yet, but that's still pretty shocking, given that plants for the most part can adapt and change faster than animals. So that's pretty depressing, pretty worrying, part of the International Survey of Plant Diversity. And this has been a real catalyst for horticultural and scientific development. And I've put lots of little engineering bits in here, so I'm hoping there'll be some bits that really excite the engineers with us tonight. Photosynthesis we've already talked about, but let's have a little look at this diagram at the factors that influence how a plant grows. So we know that plants need light of some sort, traditionally sunlight, but they need light. We know that they absorb carbon dioxide, so they need carbon dioxide in their cells for photosynthesis to happen. And they produce excess oxygen, kind of helping us all to stay alive. They're probably one of the most important organisms on the planet in that sense, because without them we wouldn't be here. They rely on temperature, they rely on the quality, and that can be poor or good quality, of the air that surrounds them. And within the roots, they need water, they need something to hold them stable, which isn't necessarily soil actually, and they need nutrients. So whilst photosynthesis is the mechanism with which plants produce carbohydrate or sugars, they actually take in a lot of their nutrients through their roots. So that's really important to bear in mind. So when we talk about, you know what it's like when you're feeling a bit low in the afternoon and you have a little, I call it a snackcident, which I had on the way home this afternoon. Accidentally drove into a petrol station, accidentally bought a bag of chocolates and had a snackcident as I ate it on the way home. I'm not proud of it. I'm having a gincident later on as well. But you take that on as sugar, and it doesn't give you nutrients. It's the quality of the fruit and vegetables that you're eating, the diet that you're taking on board that gives you the nutrients that you need to survive. And the same thing happens with plants. So just bear those factors in mind, if you will, as we start to move through these next slides, because light, air quality, temperature, roots, and nutrition are key to how we can hack plants to make them super plants, to make them even better. Blanc, fantastic French guy who, again, was an engineer, looked at the architecture of buildings, looked at the problem of rising CO2 in the atmosphere, particularly in cities. He's based in Paris, and he came up with the concept of vertical gardening, which isn't new. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were obviously around a lot earlier than he was. But he realised that, of course, if you're in a population dense area where you have rising CO2 levels and carbon emissions, what absorbs them more effectively than anything else? Well, what plants do. So he worked out that if you put a plant sideways on the side of a building, actually also controlling its apical dominance, so it pushes out rather than growing upwards, it will be slightly stressed because its roots are constrained, so it keeps it in shape. It doesn't grow too large if you choose the right plant, and it will absorb some of the carbon dioxide and it will release oxygen, so it will purify the air around that building. What a fantastic concept. And this has exploded, and unfortunately I see a lot of really beautiful shopping centres with large plastic walls on them, which really enrages me. But there are some phenomenal examples of green and living walls, and in fact you have one at the University of York as well. If you walk around, I think it's biological sciences, I think it's around there, a really stunning example of a living wall. It insulates as well, it absorbs excess water, so again can help prevent flooding. There are lots of things to recommend it in the way that we currently live. And this is one of the best examples I've ever come across. This is the ParkRoyal Hotel on Pickering in Singapore. It has a sister hotel further down a couple of blocks away, another ParkRoyal, which doesn't have these amazing balconies. Can you see how deep they are? They're about 3 meters deep. They have trees that are specially containerized and grown in substrates that give them the nutrients they need without allowing them to grow too large. You can see there that there are palm trees, so they're cycads. They've got very low, shallow roots, so they're not going to undermine the structure of these amazing balconies. And the balconies are put on the building about every 4 floors or so. So they're very dense with planting. You can see there's a metre wide walkway that goes around each of them, which I really wouldn't want to be the person going out and maintaining the plants, but people do. But some of the plants are now, they've grown so well, they're trailing down, so they're screening some of the building. The really interesting thing about this is that in Singapore, for anybody who's been there, you'll know it's extremely humid, again, high pollution rates. This is the only modern hotel that does not have air conditioning. They don't need it because those plants on the front of the building air condition it for them. They reduce the air temperature, they increase the oxygen around the area, so none of the rooms have air conditioning. So that saves a massive cost to the hotel. It's much more eco-friendly, of course. And interestingly, this hotel charges considerably more than its sister hotel further down the road with air conditioning, because people would much rather look out over the green than they would look over a normal skyscape. So a really fascinating way of developing the green wall concept and taking it just that little step further. I think it's an absolute marvel of engineering, and I haven't been to Singapore for a number of years now. I'm kind of wondering if I can maybe find a way to go for research purposes so I can enjoy the building and see how well they've grown those plants. is my favourite hack, my favourite application of horticultural science. I get ridiculously excited about this one. I know it just looks like green pipes, but this was developed by an art collective in Geneva in 2014, and they have taken algae, so again a living cell which has chlorophyll in it, so it photosynthesizes, and they've put algae into pipes on a bridge over a dual carriageway in the centre of Geneva. They have solar panels across the top, so it's creating enough energy for a pump to pump the algae through. You can actually see videos of this online, and the algae just moves through in a mesmeric way, very slowly through those pipes. Now they have filters, so it's absorbing CO2 from the stars that are passing underneath, which are fueling the growth of the algae. And every few days they filter off the algae and use it to create food, makeup, fuel and medicines. So it's an incredibly useful factory, if you like. It's effectively a farm that is stuck on the side of a bridge in a city centre. Wouldn't it be fantastic to have something like that? Here's a diagram to show you it. Wouldn't it be incredible to have something like that on every bridge through an urban setting? That would have a huge impact on reducing our carbon emissions. I know we're going to be moving towards electric vehicles a lot sooner than we thought, which is fantastic, but there will still be a legacy of these heavy vehicles, lorries and what have you, on the road for a good long time yet. So why don't we make it productive, make it into something that's fun, make it into something that's not particularly accessible on road bridges so it can't be damaged, and use it to create food supplements, vitamins, animal nutrition, human nutrition as well, in a really innovative and dynamic way. So as you can tell, I absolutely love that as a concept. I think it's really exciting. And again, one of the last times I was down at Cambridge working in the labs, they were doing a biofuel trial with algae. Those are actually hospital drip bags, and they had about, I think, 50 or 60 of those bags all hanging up. They were bubbling carbon dioxide through them. They were releasing oxygen out of the top in the end, and they were trying to work out, first of all, how easy was it to grow the algae, and that was in a polytunnel. I just walked in, I think they were a bit startled because I walked in and went, "Hello, what are you doing?" And they told me, and then went, this is top secret. But I'm presuming that 6 years on, it's not so secret anymore. But they were bubbling the carbon dioxide through to try and grow the algae so they could then investigate the different applications of algae. Now, for those who don't know about the medicinal properties of plants, to give you a little bit of context, foxgloves that grow in gardens and grow in woodlands in the UK are used to treat heart conditions. So digitalin is used to treat heart conditions, and tamoxifen, which is a well-known cancer-treating drug, is created from the clippings of yew trees. And I know there's a couple of people from the National Trust watching tonight, and the National Trust clippings from their large yew hedges get boxed up and bagged up each year and sent off to Cancer Research UK to be involved in their trials and development of tamoxifen. We don't know much about algae, and actually most of our oxygen production and carbon sequestration in the world is actually found in the sea through sea plants. It's about 90% is from sea plants. So what potential is there in these living organisms for us to potentially cure disease, potentially solve hunger and starvation? There's a huge amount of application for those. And actually, one thing I was going to put on here, but I don't think I did, is they have now created LED windows where you have windows with algae in them, one of the translucent algae in them, that photosynthesizes and again creates energy in passive housing. And you can then harvest off some of the algae. It's still in the developmental stages, it's still relatively new, but again, that will change the way that we look at how we create our houses. They need to sit better in the landscape. So we need to look at houses that have green roofs or solar panels that automatically have water butts, so we balance and use our landscape a bit better. In fact, in France now, all new houses have to have either a green roof or solar panels on them, and we could learn something there, couldn't we? That's where it starts to get really exciting. This is a facility that's growing salad crops without any natural daylight. The most famous one in the UK is one called Growing Underground, which is based just near Clapham Junction Station, and they grow in disused Second World War bomb shelter tunnels right next to the underground. They take carbon dioxide from the underground system, pump it in, and grow their lettuces and their salad crops in a completely controlled, sterile, temperate environment. The temperature is set because it's underground, it stays the same temperature throughout. They have a full spectrum of LED lights to bring out the leafy growth and the root growth without any detriments to the nutritional quality of the plants. And they harvest them and they sell them around London, and mostly they deliver them by bicycle or by electric vehicle. So they're actually growing a huge range with very low carbon emissions, with very few food miles. Again, food miles has sort of fallen to the back burner recently. We were very excited about it possibly 10 years ago, and it's not so fashionable now, maybe because we're all busy stockpiling toilet rolls and worrying about Christmas at the moment. But actually, you know, we do need to think about growing smarter. We're not a very food secure nation, and, you know, without wanting to scare too many people, coming January time, when whatever happens in Calais, you know, we could be at a stage where we're not able to get our coffee, our bananas, our alcohol, our chocolate, all of the things that we deem to be the most important food groups, and because we don't grow most of them in the UK. So, you know, we do need to be farming smarter. And one of the projects I did at the university centre that I worked at was did some work with the Netherlands, where we looked at aquaponics, where they were growing fish in tanks, and the waste from the fish was being pumped into the crops as a fertilizer, and the roots of those lettuces and micro salads were just sitting in this water that was being bubbled through with a bit of carbon dioxide. They were absorbing the nutrients from it, and we had the food at the end of it. So beautiful circular system. And in a really good closed system, you would also probably have something like chickens, and you'd also have a wormery. So you'd be growing worms to feed the fish, to feed the chickens, to create waste, to feed the plants. There's a lot of potential. This is why we need more engineers in horticulture. And this obviously appeals to all of us, I hope. It's a particularly beautiful way of growing hydroponic lettuces in Japan. So the silver thing in the middle next to the lady who's working there is actually a bridge. So they walk in from the outside of this concentric circle into the middle, where they take the little plugs of lettuce in this case and put them into rotation. So they just shift them along ever so gently as they're putting them onto the track. And as they're doing that every day, they do a set number every day, it pushes the other lettuces round and round and round the spiral. So by the end of 7 or 10 days, depending on the crop that you have, the lettuces that are ready to be harvested can be harvested on the outside edge of the circle. Isn't that beautiful? Such a simple way of growing in a beautiful cycle. So you have somebody on the outside harvesting, somebody on the inside sowing, and you have that continual motion and movement of those plants as they go round and round and round. Of course, if you get it right, you don't have any pests and diseases, but you do need to be extremely careful. So you make sure you have double entry doors, extremely rigorous hygiene practices. You're not using soil, you're possibly using UV lights to clean your water, so that's super clean as well. Because if you've got anything in the middle of there, and this is with my pest and disease head on, if you had a slug, for example, in the middle of those lettuces, you wouldn't see it for another week, and it would have wiped out half of your crop by the time you got there. And heaven help a rabbit that got in there, I wouldn't know what they would do with it. This is also really exciting. This is the application of LED lights. We're again just starting to realise how important the right spectrum of light is for growing plants. Traditionally, we grow them under high pressure sodium lights in glass houses, and there's been a little bit of work with LEDs and UV lights over the years. And we're just starting to realise that the spectrum that plants need is just that much bit wider than what we need, or what we can see rather. So the far infrared light is extremely important for root development, and the UV light is extremely important for developing the nutritional value, the secondary metabolites, those excess compounds, the chemical compounds that a plant produces to protect itself, to stop it from being fed. And those are the compounds that we use for nutrition, but also we use to help cure illnesses. And obviously sports turf it's a very specialized crop, as it were. I always found it fascinating that people could be interested in a plant that they only grow to about that big, and they maintain and they mow religiously several times a week. But one of the pressures with the development of higher quality television nowadays is that the old turf used to just be lifted and relaid or resown, and a couple of weeks later you'd play another match and it's black and white, you couldn't see anything. And again, if anyone remembers football matches and rugby matches in the 70s and 80s on black and white TVs, you couldn't tell which team people played in because they were all caked in mud, because the turf got completely ripped to shreds and it just got resown. They can't do that anymore because the pressures are on the turf to look good all year round, and also they're playing more matches regularly. So what they have been doing is having a lighting rig like this that they pull out on the back of a tractor, and it puts the high pressure sodium lights bang on top of the turf and blasts it with heat and light to force the grass to grow really quickly, so you get a nice sward to mow. Several problems with that. Obviously the heat isn't great for turf. Turf actually likes growing in reasonably cold weather, doesn't like being too hot, and the weight of these rigs is causing compaction, which again affects the, can you believe it, bounceability of the turf. The bounceability which is measured, it needs to be consistent all the way across. You need to be having as smooth a pitch as possible. So these LED lights have been developed. You can pull them out with one hand, they don't compact the soil, and they actually can be set to grow better roots for a few days, followed by better leaf growth as and when. They can also be used to retard the growth of the turf as well, which traditionally has been done using hormone chemicals, which isn't ideal. It's not great for sports people, to be honest, and there are some worrying developments about the high incidence rates of, for example, some cancers in football and rugby players because they've been sliding through these hormone treated turfs. So now by using the light and balancing it, you can actually reduce the use of chemical hormones that are used to treat the turf, so it doesn't have to be cut. You don't want to be cutting that turf just before a match. You want it to be a nice fine point. And actually a former student of mine is now assistant greenkeeper. I'm not sure exactly what his role is at Leeds United, which is some sort of footballington team. It's not something that I'm particularly interested in, but I remember he did some research in LED lights on turf for his final year, and it was that research that led to him getting the job. Leeds went, "We need you on our team, when can you start?" And that was a fantastic moment for me to see that research being used to good effect. This is another thing I get ridiculously excited about. Again, we're only just starting to properly understand this, is mycorrhizae. So we're just starting to understand the relationship between fungi, so mycorrhizae, and roots, plant roots. So plants that are kept in the soil and not harvested within a year, so not your standard vegetable crops, develop relationships with mycorrhizae, and it's a symbiotic relationship in most cases. They wrap around the outside of the root, massively increasing the surface area of the root itself, allowing water to be taken up along with nutrients, and in return the roots exude sugars that the mycorrhizae feed on. So certainly when I was learning to be a horticulturist, when I was first studying, I was told you could never plant a rose bush where a rose bush had been, because there was a thing called rose transplant sickness. And that's actually because the roots of members of the Rosaceae family release chemicals into the soil to stop competition, which is why you've never seen a rose bush, a baby rose bush, underneath an adult rose bush, and why you've never seen a baby apple tree. You've never seen a sapling directly underneath an apple tree. So I was told you had to dig out a cubic metre of soil around the old rose bush, which is a ton of soil, literally a ton, line out the hole with double layers of cardboard, backfill with completely new compost, put your new rose bush in and cross your fingers, because it probably still wouldn't survive and it would wilt and die within a couple of years of planting. What we now know is if you put a decent range of mycorrhizae onto the roots of your second rose bush, you can plant it into the soil and it will establish perfectly well, thank you very much. And that's a real development for us. And these mycorrhizae, we're starting to realise that they have other applications as well. For anybody who follows a plant-based diet, corn is effectively a mycorrhizae. It's a soil fungus that has been developed into a reasonably protein-rich and reasonably tasty, according to my kids, protein source that's meat-free. The reason I was telling you about this is because at Nottingham, the University of Nottingham, they have a department of the rhizosphere, which is so much more exciting to me than it probably is to most people. But what they do is they have CT scans, and they have a CT scanning machine. They grow plants in pipes. And because we can't see what's going on in the soil, we don't always know what's happening to plants below ground. And this is the last frontier for us. We're manipulating the leaves, we're manipulating the flowering, we're manipulating the sunlight, the chemicals, the water that's being applied. We don't really know what role the soil has and what role other roots have on that plant. So at Nottingham, they have these large tubes. They get picked up by a robot in the middle of the night, because you don't need a human there to scan them, taken over to the CT scanner, scanned through the night, and they create a 3D image of the roots, the rhizosphere, the root zone. And they're starting to notice how pockets of air and rocks are starting to affect the root structure, the root architecture. And one of the things they're looking at, again, this is to do with agricultural crops, is looking at modifying plants, because, for example, wheat, we've got about as far as we can go with wheat. We've got it to the optimum height, we've got it to the optimum head size, we've got the best possible yield we can get, we've worked out the perfect spacing for planting them out. But what we still need to do, if we're going to feed everybody, is grow a little bit faster. So we can't really put LEDs into every field. It's not particularly practical. It would be very attractive to people who are light-fingered as well. There's a lot of risk of damage. So what they're looking at is looking at the root architecture. So if you look at 5 there with those root angles, those lateral roots, what they're wondering is, could you adjust and alter the plant so the longer roots that go down and take a lot of the plant's energy are cut off, leaving only lateral roots, so the plant could grow a little bit faster in a very, very small amount of soil. So that soil was then be treated like a substrate, so like an inert medium, and nutrients and potentially mycorrhizae would be added in there to boost it nutritionally. So you get better nutrition in your crop and it would grow faster because it's not growing deep. So hugely, hugely exciting stuff that we're investigating in the UK. Coming towards the end of the presentation, I just wanted to show you a couple of things that, again, I find inspiring, that people are starting to use plants in a really different way. You may have noticed that we're starting to do a lot more in terms of roof gardens in the UK in urban settings. So certainly around Leeds and definitely in London, less so in York. It's a bit more historic with fewer flat roofs, and we're starting to see these green infrastructure being put in. This was a derelict railway line in New York. It's now known as the High Line, associated with a lot of crime and deprivation. It was completely unused, and it's been restored and planted by a phenomenal plantsman called Piet Oudolf, who's Dutch, with mostly grasses and perennials that don't need a huge amount of maintenance, are visually impactful, and purify the air. And guess what? It's become this huge, tourist attraction, but also micro businesses have popped up around it. You can walk along it. It is safer than it's ever been in that area. And it's just completely regenerated how people associate plants and landscape and well-being within a very, very urban setting. This is the proposal for the next version of the High Line, which is called the Low Line in New York. And this is actually an abandoned tram storage depot underneath one of the main thoroughfares in New York City. And they're taking the knowledge and experience they've had from growing high up in very low root density areas and growing these amazing plants to growing them entirely underground. The swirly bit at the top of the screen there are mirrors, and refracting light that are taking natural sunlight and bouncing it into the ground. And what they want to do is to green up this area with moss walls that are absorbing again carbon dioxide, releasing oxygen, and creating a safe but entirely underground green space for people who are in that very, very urban part of the city. They're trying to crowdfund for it at the moment. It's being led and inspired by several well-known American celebrities. Who knows what will happen? There's a lot of change going over there as well as over here at the moment. But I just love the idea that a combination of engineering, ingenuity, and an understanding of how plants work can lead to something as completely bonkers and off the wall as an underground garden. And finally, just to finish off, we go back to Charles Darwin. A grain in the balance will determine which individual will live and which will die, which variety or species shall increase in number and which shall decrease or finally become extinct. Plants don't need us, but we need plants. We can choose how to work with plants to our advantage, and we can use them for the greater good. We can use them to fix people, to feed people, and to clean up the planet. But it's our choice. It's that grain in the balance, those little things that we can do that can make it hugely successful or not at all. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Sarah. You can probably hear some of our claps. We need to switch on our microphones, but
thank you.
Thanks very much. That was very interesting.
Thanks,
I've written
Alan.
lots of notes. There's so many interesting facts. So I've written lots of notes anyway. So if anybody would like to ask a question, the best way to do it is to go to the third on the right icon, the raise hand, and raise that, and make sure you switch on your microphone, and you can ask a question. I can't see if anybody's raised their hand though.
Graham Collett has raised his hand.
All right. Graham, are you there? He may have lowered his hand. On my screen it says lower hand. Someone called Sean said thank you very much.
Thank you.
So are there any questions? Well, I could start with a question. So the LEDs that were driving the underground, I think you said in London, hopefully they were being driven by solar panels above the ground. Were they, or were they plugging into the mains?
I think at the moment they're plugging into the mains, but they're looking at ways of actually using kinetic energy from the underground as the underground goes past.
Oh, right.
They're looking at ways of using that. It's still a relatively passive enterprise because you've got the LEDs and you've got a little bit of movement for the irrigation system to move through the plants, but it doesn't need a huge amount of energy. So it's actually relatively low carbon.
Right, but they still have to light the LEDs, of course, so they need the electricity for that. Yes.
Which is still obviously much lower than sodium lights. If you want to see examples of it, there is actually a research centre in Selby that your members might be interested in visiting, called Stockbridge Technology Centre, where they
Stockbridge, did you say?
Stockbridge Technology Centre in Selby, and they do visits, obviously when it's safe to do so. And they have a massive LED research area where they're doing all sorts of trials at the moment into this sort of system.
Okay, hopefully now I've started the questions, someone will ask a question.
It's always really hard, isn't it? Particularly at this sort of thing. Nobody really wants to make eye contact, and I can't see anybody to check.
No. The thing is that engineers normally, I think I told you that normally our question and answer session lasts for almost as long as a lecture now. So I'm just waiting. John Hamilton, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, it's not so much a question, Sarah, as a comment. Fascinating talk, but it all links in very much to the civil engineering work that the company I was working for, Arup, is doing. One of one of their key drivers these days is sustainable development.
Yeah,
and
very much
a lot of the things that you've flagged up are fascinating from an engineering and sustainable development point of view.
Exactly. I've yes, thank you. Arup's one of the big leaders in green infrastructure, and particularly like the way that they look at tree planting in urban settings, recognizing the need for trees, but also growing them in a way that they're not going to be stressed and damaged and therefore cause risks to people. But one of my constant challenges, you speak to any horticulturist, they'll say the same. How do we get people into gardening? We can't get enough youngsters into horticulture. Nobody wants to grow things anymore. And I have always said, let me talk to the engineers, because if you're an engineer, you like to solve problems. Yeah, that's your job, isn't it? Solving problems. Let's give you a little green problem, and we've got lights, and we've got energy, and we've got roots, and we've got lots of pipe work and lots of heat. And it's engineers who will solve it. It's a perfect synergy. I think what we do as horts is we love the plants a bit too much, and we don't think about the potential of using other industries and other partners to develop that. And that's something that I think Arup have got really, really right. It's really exciting to see some of the construction work they've been involved with, particularly around the Millennium Park in London for the Olympics.
Yes. It's a pity the garden bridge didn't go ahead, but maybe that was just a step too far.
I know, it was a little bit too much, which was modelled on the idea of the High Line. They saw the High Line in New York and said, we should do this in London. And you're absolutely right, it would have been sensational had it been done properly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think
Sean's just asked, are the LEDs likely to become widely available to the general public? Yeah, you can actually get a really nice little LED set now, not for a huge amount of money, from IKEA. So you can actually get LED lights to grow your own herbs on your windowsill in your north-facing flat where you've got no natural daylight. They are available. It's just making sure you've got the range, the spectrum. And at the moment, we're moving from the ones that are obviously red and blue, which make your eyes look funny when you look at your basil and you wonder why it's gone purple, because the light is affecting your vision, to white lights, white LEDs, but they are really, really interesting potential for them to develop a bit further, and the price keeps coming down. Yes, Anne has just put that your son-in-law is an unemployed horticultural scientist in Sussex, struggling to get work. You might want to contact me. There might be a few contacts that I know down there, actually. We need more horts, but we need to raise the profile of the industry. Absolutely. It doesn't help when people in government refer to it as a low-skilled industry, and there's still a perception that horticulture is something you do when you are too thick to do anything else. I've had numerous students over the years turn up saying they've been told by their careers advisor to go into horticulture because you get to drive a white van and you're your own boss. And actually, some of the cleverest people I know are people who work in horticulture, and they may not even think that they're incredibly intelligent and bright, but they are natural inveterate problem solvers. So you're absolutely right. It's an industry that has always worried itself silly about its reputation rather than going out and shouting about what it does. I think I've stunned everyone into silence.
I'm sure there must be questions. I'm just trying to have a look.
Contact me online afterwards, no problem at all. Hi, Cherie, thank you. That's really nice to see you virtually.
That's true, they did get in touch.
Yes. Actually, I'll just, because you mentioned about the low line, I've been to the high line quite a few times, but yeah. Has the low line actually started, or was that an artist impression, or was that a real photo?
That was the artist impression. And the last time I heard it was a couple of years ago. They were trying to crowdfund for it. Structurally, they knew it would be fine because it was a tram shed that had been there forever, but they hadn't progressed further than that.
Right. Andy Mendes, did you have a question?
I did, as neither a horticulturalist nor an engineer. I'm a gate crasher, but I was a chemist.
Welcome to the green side.
And you've talked a lot about exploiting plants. One of the big sort of controversial topics kicking around, well, I haven't heard much about it recently, is genetic modification. Yes. I wonder if you'd like to just explain where horticulture got to in terms of actually getting in there and doing a Darwin.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one in horticulture because the lines are quite blurred, even more so than they are in agriculture. You know, it's all very well within agriculture. You talk about Dolly the sheep and you get a very strong reaction one way or the other. Within the biological horticultural science side of things, we recognize that we need to grow better. So we recognize that we do need to do something to improve the quality of plants. But plants have been doing this for years, for centuries, for millennia, and actually we've been doing this for as long as we've cultivated plants. We have taken the traits of one plant and crossed it with another plant. So genetic modification for us isn't such a big leap because it's very, very similar to what we already do when we breed plants, but it's possibly more controllable, possibly more instant. You know, it can take 20 years to develop a different shade of sweet pea and stabilize it, and you could potentially grow it and stabilize it within a very short period of time. However, we don't have, I think at the moment, we don't have the infrastructure to keep it as safe as possible, and that needs to be a globally agreed infrastructure. And there's still that perception of Frankenstein food. We don't want things that are messed with, or if they are messed with, we need to understand exactly what they've been messed with. But it isn't that different to what we naturally do in the garden when we take a plant and wipe the pollen onto another plant.
Sure, but you've sort of touched on the edges, haven't you? And you talked about, well, globally we need to control. Well, realistically, you'll never get a 100% global agreement. No. Do you see the dangers of Frankenstein plants outweighing the opportunity, for instance, of fixing ash dieback or the fixing sort of serious plant diseases?
Yeah, again, really difficult one. Again, we already have F1 plants which are sterile, so they are bred in such a way that they become super plants. Particularly bedding plants like petunias will grow in a beautiful way, but you can't grow them again. And there is a concern that if you did genetically modify plants, particularly food crops, you would have a situation where developing countries would be reliant on fresh seed year after year after year, and you create a further poverty trap. So there's definitely some real ethical issues in modification for sure. I think with things like ash dieback, one of the challenges is actually we were reproducing plants. We weren't reproducing sexually, we were reproducing them from cutting, so they were all genetically exactly the same. They were clones of their parents, and we were importing them in en masse, and they were all a little bit vulnerable to ash dieback. And what's interesting is they're doing some research in the south where they're planting as many different cultivars of ash around a site where there is ash dieback and monitoring which ones are susceptible and which ones are resistant. And the ones that are resistant tend to be the older cultivars, the ones that have been around for longer, the ones that have had more genetic mutations because they've come from a range of parents. So I think that's quite interesting, and I don't think that genetic modification would be the silver bullet to stop pathogen of that sort. I think it needs to be a multi-level approach. For a start, we should be growing our own ash. We shouldn't be importing it. Secondly, we should be growing probably from seed. It's cheap. You get those genetic mutations naturally. And we need to be supporting locally grown because we know that they're going to be more robust. Slower grown will give you better quality wood products in the long run.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy.
Any more questions? Well, I had another one then. So you were talking about roses. Well, you said a couple of plants where they had this process. It was something to do, I wrote down the word, but I didn't spell it right. Mycorrhizae.
Mycorrhizae, yes.
Mycorrhizae, where you said they did something where they would stop other plants from growing. What was the word you used to this?
Oh, it's completely gone from my head for the moment. It's an allelopathic reaction, which is when a plant produces chemicals that are exuded through the roots to stop competition. So
but it's competition from themselves, from their own offspring.
Yeah, from each other, yeah. So turf actually does that. So grass sends out tiny amounts of these chemicals to stop other plants growing, which is why it can be quite hard to establish other plants in a grass setting. One of the most noxious ones, if you like, is walnut. You won't find anything ever growing underneath a walnut tree. It just kills everything else in the soil. And the same happens with Rhododendron ponticum as well, actually. If you go to any of the big, large, particularly National Trust parks with big rhododendron bushes, you'll find, again, very little growing underneath. But it's a known phenomenon within the members of the Rosaceae family, so apples, plums, pears, roses. You won't find any of the offspring growing underneath them because the chemicals have stopped them from growing there. So by using the mycorrhizae, what they're doing is they're wrapping around the roots. They protect the roots from those alleles, from those chemicals, and they access water and nutrients from a further distance, so the plant has a chance to establish itself, even though the soil is technically contaminated by the parent plant.
Right. It's all sophisticated, really.
It is.
But it also gives an insight into the problems that one often has when you go into the garden, which you just hadn't thought about. You know.
Absolutely.
So, yes.
When I had my first garden, I used to save all the labels of everything that I grew, and I realised that actually that's incredibly depressing, because at the end of each year you went through the box and realised how much money you'd lost by throwing things in the garden and watching them die. And you know, I have three children and a dog and a husband, so they're the biggest pests in my garden. It can be quite difficult to establish things in my garden, which is why I have to be Darwinian. It's the survival of the fittest for anything to grow.
Yes. Yes. Are there any more questions? I'm giving a pause. Okie doke. Well, can I ask everybody? Well, everybody could switch on their microphone so that we can give Sarah an uproarious applause for such an interesting lecture, because it was just so interesting. It had so many interesting, detailed, and different facts.
It
so
was
I
very
could
fast.
really enjoy it. So if we could just clap and say thanks very much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
And I'll just say, yes, it was marvellous. And we had a maximum of 66 people, I think. I can now hear my echo, but the average was about 60, so that was very good, a very good number.
Fantastic.
So that was excellent.
That's really good. I'm glad you've all enjoyed it. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.
I had a request for me making available the recording. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm happy for that.
Right. I need to know how to turn off the recording now. I'll stop recording.